I think it is eminently possible he's not good at politics. I would go as far as to say it's definitely true that he's not very good at politics. But he said that, right? He sort of has made no secret. When you ask him about what Starmerism, he said there isn't Starmerism and there never will be. It's a bit like Theresa May in a way, that I think they're kind of probably would make quite good secretaries of state or even permanent secretaries. But there's this sort of mindset almost that, and I don't know whether it comes from his legal background, that politics is the sort of mucky stuff that other people do, rather than it being right at the centre of how you do these things.
So Keir Starmer has announced he will be leaving Downing Street in a handful of weeks. This is why. Hi everyone, Neil here, host of This Is Why. Do hope this finds you well. Look, he did say he was going nowhere, that he was going to face any challenge to his leadership head on. But in the end, it was obvious to everyone in government, from Larry the Cat up, that the Prime Minister had lost the confidence of his own party.
The question my party is asking now is whether I am best placed to lead us into the next general election. I have heard the answer of my parliamentary party to that question, and I accept that answer with good grace.
Now, look, I will say, I did think it was a pretty dignified, pretty statesmanlike performance. But in that moment, as he stood behind the lectern and in front of the cameras, you got just a glimpse of the personal cost Sir Keir Starmer is experiencing because of this resignation.
And when I leave the biggest job in the country, I shall spend more time on the most important job, being the best husband I can to my fantastic wife, Vic, who has been a rock by my side through good times and bad, and being the best dad I can to my beautiful children, who are my pride and my joy.
For now, though, the Starmers are staying in Downing Street. This is just the start of a transition to our 7th Prime Minister in 10 years, most likely Andy Burnham. But when the removal vans turn up at number 10 to take the bags the short distance to his constituency home in Islington, what will Keir Starmer actually be remembered for? Rob Powell is our political correspondent. Rob, look, what changed? What changed? I left this office on Friday with Keir Starmer's words ringing in my ears. I'm going nowhere. If there's a leadership challenge, I am going to fight it. Today, I arrive in the office to see Keir Starmer crying on the steps of number 10. So what changed?
Look, I think to an extent the position of I will stay and fight, that he has to say that, right? For as long as you are a Prime Minister and until you resign, you know, you sort of have to say that you're staying, because the minute you start to say that, you know, you're actually going to reflect on things, the minute everyone shuffles you out the door, and it stops being, I guess, your decision. So to an extent, I guess I would query whether even on Friday when Starmer stood in front of cameras and said, you know, I'll stay and fight, whether deep down he meant it, quite frankly. That said, I was talking to someone over the weekend who had spoken to him privately on Friday, and they said he was telling people exactly what he was saying in public, and he seemed like he meant it. I think maybe what changed is that he had a series of quiet conversations with cabinet ministers, with allies, and they basically laid out the blunt reality of the situation. You know, we heard that the chief whip basically said, you've lost the parliamentary party. You had people like Yvette Cooper, you know, who are not prone to sort of acts of, you know, political impulse, if you like, telling him that he should probably set out a timetable now. People like Heidi Alexander as well, who, yes, has links back to Andy Burnham, but is not exactly a kind of foe round the cabinet table for Keir Starmer, saying the same thing and making it plain, you know, through their allies anyway, that they were saying this to Starmer as well. So I think what happened was that bit of Keir Starmer that was sort of still in there, that bit that when you think back to when they lost the Hartlepool by-election in opposition, and he said, if someone else can do a better job, then, you know, for the good of the country, I'll go. What I've been asking myself for weeks, if not months now, is whether that bit of him was sort of still in there, or whether the kind of this almost fight that he seems to have got in the last few months, and whether the trappings of power had kind of dialed it down. I think that bit inside him probably came back up. He realised the game was up, that he was going to have to leave as Prime Minister, He still had some choice about how he did it, and he could either do it going down in a ball of flames with cabinet resignations, or he could do it as he did this morning.
Let's look back on at what I believe is the shortest tenure by a Labour Prime Minister, and examine where it actually went wrong, because, you know, we do tend to forget he won a thumping majority, a landslide majority, and in circumstances like that, you'd expect his government to hit the ground running rather than, as actually happened, hit the ground face first.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can probably trace back where some of the sort of seeds of failure were sown even before they got into government. You know, the fact that there very clearly wasn't a thought through political plan, a project to come in, kind of grip the levers of power and orientate them in the direction that the Labour government wanted to go. You know, the whole point of Sue Gray coming in was apparently that was going to be her job, but it clearly didn't happen. So
Remind us who Sue Gray is.
Sue Gray is, she was very senior civil servant, famously ran the inquiry into Boris Johnson over Partygate, left the civil service and joined Labour while they were still in opposition and was Keir Starmer's first chief of staff, but basically got in a power struggle with the guy that succeeded her, Morgan McSweeney, lost out and was sacked. But you know, the idea was that this was someone who knew their way around Whitehall and Westminster, knew how to, you know, bend the sort of instrument of state to the will of Downing Street. But there didn't seem to be any plan to hit the ground running. So I think that was one problem, the lack of plan as they went in. The second problem, which again you can trace back into opposition, was the constraints that they put on themselves through the manifesto. The biggest one probably being the lock on income tax, national insurance and VAT. Now, sensible political promise to make, given that the incoming from the Tories were Labour are going to put up your taxes. I mean, spoiler alert, they did put up taxes, just not those ones. But by ruling out those big boys of tax raising measures, the really big revenue raisers, they had to just scramble around for lots of little ones, which didn't really get them to where they needed to be for the money, but really, really harmed them politically still. And it's that promise, the promise not to put up those taxes, that landed them in the position of, you know, going after winter fuel, employer NI, inheritance tax on farmers. So it put them in such a tight position that they had no room for manoeuvre, that they had to go to these other measures that were politically, you know, incredibly unpopular on several fronts.
But did they? Did they have to? The political event that sticks most keenly in my mind in the early stages of the Keir Starmer premiership, and of course with his Chancellor Rachel Reeves next door, was the winter fuel stuff. And that to me just seemed like a complete own goal. Why would you make one of the first things you did as a government going after pensioners?
Yeah, and I think you can, from time in office, the original sin, the moment when Keir Starmer's popularity started to go through the floor, I think you can trace back to winter fuel, absolutely. Not so much because of the sort of decision to do it, although obviously that was catastrophic. You know, you can make a policy argument that it's a perfectly logical thing to do to try and means test a kind of arbitrary payment that is going to a group of people, you know, who overall there is less poverty in that group of people compared to working age adults, certainly compared to, you know, the crisis in young adults. It's not so much the sort of policy of it, it's more of they just launched it on the country and the party with absolutely no political preparation for it. And then rather than making an argument about why they were doing it, they tried to say that they're being forced to do it because of the situation the Conservatives put themselves in. So I think the original sin you can see in there is what brought Starmer down time and time and time again, thinking that the politics of a decision is unimportant, thinking that the sort of selling it to MPs and selling it to the country, having arguments about why you're doing things, neglecting and relegating that part of politics and just thinking all you need to do is make a sort of cold rational argument about something and people will buy it. But you're right, I think that's the moment where it all started to really go wrong, and I think you can see from polling that is the moment where people just started to think these guys are just like the rest of them.
And it was compounded, wasn't it, by what appeared to be an entirely tone-deaf number 11 and number 10 Downing Street when it came to growth and assisting business. I mean, you can look at the measures that they brought in there, changes to the minimum wage, changes to employment rights, to employer national insurance contributions. All of those things made doing business more expensive in this country, whilst on the other hand, they were saying, we're all about growth. It's all about growth. We've got to get the country growing.
Yeah, and they spent the first year of their time in office as well painting a very, very bleak picture, of the current situation and where they're going. And we know from talking to businesses that had an impact on business confidence as well. But the flip of that is that whilst they introduced this stuff like employment rights reforms, when you talk to those kind of Labour rank and file members and campaigners, they were frustrated that they were bringing stuff in, but then not really vocalising it, not really campaigning on it. So I think they were, they ended up with the worst of both worlds, quite frankly. They brought in stuff that had tangible impacts on business, but then they didn't even try and make an argument to gather in the political upside of bringing that in, partly maybe because they were too afraid of doing it. They thought that business would not like that. So, they just ended up in this sort of squidgy middle ground where they were getting the worst of both worlds. They were getting none of the political upside, but sort of all of the policy downside.
Rob, you know that I think you are the seer of seers when it comes to Westminster. But I am going to challenge you slightly. Your point earlier that Labour arrived in government without a plan. I see what you're saying, but didn't Labour arrive in government with lots of little plans? Because if you look at the domestic policy agenda, they have done a significant amount of things. I'm thinking about, NHS waiting lists. I'm thinking about, the nationalisation of the railways. I mean, these are big things. Is it not the case that perhaps rather than having no plan whatsoever, they just didn't have an overarching strategy?
Yeah, I mean, there have been, I guess you can argue, there have been lots of plans. There have been the priorities, the pledges that have been laid out over time. There's been the talk about mission-based government and things like that. I think when I talk about a lack of plan, I think that there wasn't a sort of practical, physical roadmap for, say, the first 100 days. What we are actually going to do, the levers we're going to pull around Westminster and Whitehall to start to affect change. I think, what you're getting at is that the flip side of this hasn't just been 2 years of nothing. There has been, a fair bit that has been done. We've already talked about things like workers' rights. I think renters' rights as well. Those are two areas that I think actually, if it is to be Andy Burnham coming in, he will change the sort of vibes and the language around those two policy areas. And you'll probably, much to the anger of Starmer supporters, find that you've got people kind of going, well, Andy Burnham's brought in this stuff that means that I can stay in my rental flat and I can't be kicked out any easily, because he's good at that sort of communication side of things. I think on the kind of day-to-day managing of big tensions within government, you're right to an extent, I think, about the health service, but I would say part of the reason why they've made some inroads on things like waiting times is they have thrown a heck of a lot of cash at the NHS. That has been prioritised in budgets and in spending reviews for a lot of money. So, to an extent, you might expect there to be progress. One area where I think you can tangibly say, at least over the last year or so, we have seen the kind of political vision for what they want to do turned into something practical and that actually being implemented is at the Home Office, the notoriously difficult department where often nothing gets done. I think since you've had Shabana Mahmood as Home Secretary, you have seen that happen both in policy terms, but you've seen her engage in the politics of it as well. She isn't afraid to have the argument both inside the party and with voters about what she's doing. And yeah, to an extent, you're seeing some initial signs that may be working. So yeah, I think he can point to some things that he has started to do. And maybe when people accuse him of not bringing the change that they were promised, half of me wonders whether the change that people want is achievable under any government at the moment. When you talk to people about cost of living, I think people look back at a time when everything was far more affordable and cheaper. Like, we ain't going back to that place. Okay. So I wonder whether anyone can achieve that. Maybe it was hopeless from the start, but given that, he needed good politics to push through.
Okay, I really need to clarify what you were just saying there, Rob. I mean, are you genuinely saying that this was not Sir Keir Starmer's fault, that instead the political and economic difficulties that this country face are bigger than any majority that Labour could hope for?
I think what I'm saying is that the political and economic conditions facing this government mean that in 2 years, I find it really hard to know what the sort of tangible change people would have wanted and how it could have been delivered in just 2 years. So that's on one side, but the way you square that circle and you get through it is through politics. is through, selling the stuff that you are doing and figuring out a story you can tell about why you should stick with me and why these things will happen in the coming years.
Yeah, you have to tell the story, but you also have to avoid gaining a reputation for U-turns. You have to avoid gaining a reputation for being pretty brutal with members of your own team. I mean, both of which Sir Keir Starmer achieved a reputation for very, very quickly.
Absolutely. And I think this comes back to one interesting argument that I think you're already seeing sort of play out amongst the kind of commentariat at the moment on this question of, is Keir Starmer a decent man? This is the sort of analysis you hear of him as Prime Minister. A decent man that just wasn't up to the job. That's the sort of Allies version of events. The critical version of events when they, point at certain sort of characteristics, certain ruthless characteristics that Keir Starmer had, is that no, he's not a decent man at all. What I would say is that somewhere in between, there's a sort of passivity about Keir Starmer, I think. And I think in certain situations, it's too easy to think that kind of passive character isn't a choice and doesn't have moral ramifications. So when ministers were being sacked and reshuffled out to make way for sort of new blood, as Downing Street were calling it, Keir Starmer wasn't calling people to tell them that. So I don't know whether in his head he thinks, well, why does that matter? But I think in that sort of passivity of not doing things, that becomes a moral choice as well.
Is it possible that he's just not very good at politics?
I think it is eminently possible he's not good at politics. I would go as far as to say it's definitely true that he's not very good at politics. But he said that, right? He sort of has made no secret. When you ask him about what Starmerism, he said there isn't Starmerism and there never will be. I think this is the problem, is that I think it's a bit like Theresa May in a way, that I think they're kind of probably would make quite good secretaries of state or even permanent secretaries. But there's this sort of mindset almost that, and I don't know whether it comes from his legal background, that politics is the sort of mucky stuff that other people do, rather than it being right at the centre of how you do these things. Like I would, another massive U-turn on his watch, the welfare rebellion. What we are seeing now as a way to basically end up in a place where the welfare bill can be brought down is some very smart policy, but also smart politics in the Department of Work and Pensions with Pat McFadden and Alan Milburn, the ex-health secretary. Because what you are seeing is, yes, an attempt to actually investigate, what the big problems are that are causing young people to sort of slide out of education and go straight on to benefits. But what you are also seeing is a political exercise to guide elements of the Labour Party to a place where they feel they can vote for something that will decrease the welfare bill. And it's no surprise that these are sort of two old hands in politics that are sat on top of it. Whereas before, it was just thought, well, the figure's too high and we need to bring it down.
I love the idea of, an effective politician being one who isn't afraid to get his hands dirty, that actually it's in the muck that the running of the country happens. Because actually the one bit of the job that Starmer A seemed to be good at and B seemed to enjoy was the international stuff, the statesman stuff. And arguably, on one of the big geopolitical issues of our time, or two of them in fact, Iran war, Ukraine, he seems to have got it right.
I think sort of internationally, I don't think he has really made too many slip-ups at all. He did well with Donald Trump initially anyway, but even actually when that started to get hairy, I think he did pretty well there as well. It felt like he sort of started standing up to Trump at the point where it was probably quite a well-judged moment, whereas right in the beginning, I know everyone sort of felt it was a bit fawning and a little bit sort of sloppy what he was doing when he presented the letter in the White House and things like that. But ultimately, it ended up with us getting, an all right trade arrangement and a carve out from some of the tariffs. So I think that was played smart. And then I think the other achievement that people notch up for Keir Starmer is sort of restoring credibility on the world stage. I query that a little bit because I think that actually started under Rishi Sunak. It was under Rishi Sunak that you saw things like the Windsor Framework update to the Brexit deal happen, the warmer relations between the UK and the EU. So I think Rishi Sunak started putting the UK back on maybe slightly more of a stable footing internationally, but Keir Starmer has certainly carried that on. But I think maybe that's just because he feels more comfortable around the kind of the summits and the sort of diplomatic receptions that you go to when you're on the world stage like that. And it's also maybe for someone like Keir Starmer, it's easy for him to kind of gauge who he's up against, how he takes them on and how he approaches them, rather than necessarily trying to deal with the kind of knotty, weedy tribal politics of the Labour Party, but also, a wider electorate now that are being pushed and battered in various directions by the kind of angsty social media climate that we live in, and also the kind of hell-raising anger whipper-uppers of people like Nigel Farage and Zach Polanski as well. I think he just struggled to wrap his head around how to do that, but he sort of had the measure of the international diplomatic kind of society. He could get them, he could understand it, and he could understand how to navigate it better.
We were talking before we started recording, and over the past few years, you and I have covered more than a few prime ministerial resignations, haven't we? And I just wonder if it is a measure of the lack of impact that this man has made in political terms, in personal terms, on the body politic as a whole, that it didn't feel like a massive day in politics when Sir Keir Starmer stood outside in front of the lectern, stood in front of that lectern and announced that he was going in a matter of weeks. It didn't feel like a massive moment in politics. And I just wondered if that is in part because everyone, and I include the media in this, had already made their peace with his departure a long time ago.
Yeah, I think you're right. There has been a long build-up to this, and what we were almost waiting for wasn't so much the moment where we decided Keir Starmer was going to go, but maybe the moment where it became obvious the person who was going to take over from him. It maybe felt in a funny sort of way that was what Keir Starmer was waiting for as well, that announcement has come today and not a week, 2 weeks, a month ago. How will he be remembered? You can't underestimate what he did in opposition, I think. From and I kind of hesitate to say that to an extent because, there is an argument that any old Labour leader could have potentially defeated the Tories in 2024 because it's just where the country was. They were sick and tired of the Conservatives. They'd been in power for 14 years and they just wanted anyone but them. But I think that would be to underestimate the change that you saw that went on within the Labour Party over those 5 years. I remember I went to most of the Jeremy Corbyn Labour conferences. And then remember sitting in one of the Keir Starmer Labour conferences in opposition where I think it must have been after the Queen had died, where everyone sat for the national anthem and there wasn't a peep coming out of anyone. So that does show you a substantial change that happened within Labour to pull them back to a place where actually people did feel that they would be able to vote for them again. But even in that, I think that some of the ways he went around that, was he more brutal than he needed to be with some around Jeremy Corbyn and the left? The Diane Abbott affair of basically kicking her out of the party and it looking like she might not be able to stand as a Labour candidate in the last election didn't win him many admirers among those people as well. But I think you can't underestimate that he, and this is something that a Starmer sympathiser, a Starmer kind of loyalist was putting to me over the weekend when they were talking about Andy Burnham was he wasn't there during those miserable years. He picked up sticks and left in the early part of Jeremy Corbyn's tenure and leadership, and wasn't there throughout the whole of the opposition time where they were trying to drive out these elements of the party that they felt stood in the way of them winning a general election. And I think that's why there are some who are around Starmer that still feel very bitter that there is now this expectation that he is able to just sort of swan in and take control of the government and the party, given you have got Keir Starmer who won a leadership election, who spent 5 years in opposition, making the party into something that could be elected again, then won a general election as well. That someone has won one by-election in Makerfield and feels that they should be Prime Minister, I think is agitating quite a few people close to the Prime Minister. But I think they also understand that right now there might not be anything they can do about it.
Now, for up-to-the-minute information on what is going on in politics, you might want to head to the website, skynews.com. And the podcast team, well, they're keeping busy as well. Keep your eyes and ears peeled for a special extra episode of Electoral Dysfunction. Beth Rigby and the team will be bringing you their thoughts. And then tomorrow morning we have, of course, Politics at Sam and Anne's, our deputy political editor, and Anne McAlvoy. They'll be going through what might come next in politics as we start to see the changing of the guard from Sir Keir Starmer to well, we think Andy Burnham. Anyway, that's your lot from us. Do get in touch with your thoughts. Why@sky.uk is always the email. We're back tomorrow.